Harry Johnson came home 3 hours early that Tuesday evening. He had skipped the firm's dinner to surprise Mary, to sit beside her, rub her swollen feet, and talk to their unborn daughter through her belly like he used to before the deadlines swallowed his evenings whole. But the moment he stepped through the front door of his own home, he got the shock of his life. Hello friends, and welcome to today's story. Before we go any further, hit that like button, subscribe and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Lagos, Atlanta, Manchester, Toronto? We want to hear from you. Harry Johnson was a man who believed in order. He wore his black suit the way other men wore armor, pressed, purposeful and impenetrable. He had built a reputation at his firm on precision and calm. Colleagues called him dependable. Clients called him trustworthy. His mother called him her greatest achievement. And his mother's opinion had always mattered more than it should have. Eunice Johnson was not a cruel woman, or so Harry had always told himself. She was strict, she was particular. She had raised Harry alone with discipline and sacrifice, and the green suit she wore every day was her uniform for a world she had fought hard to earn a place in. Harry had learned early that questioning Eunice was not something you did. You respected her. You listened. You adapted. His wife Mary had tried. God knows she had tried. Mary was 8 months pregnant now, her braided hair usually pinned neat, her pink maternity dress the one splash of warmth in a house that had slowly grown cold. She laughed easily, or she used to. Lately, Harry had noticed the laugh arriving a little slower, her eyes carrying something he couldn't name. He had told himself it was the pregnancy, the exhaustion. He told himself a lot of things. He should have asked her. He should have been home sooner. Because what Harry Johnson saw when he stepped into his own living room that evening was not the warm surprise he had imagined on the drive home. It was his mother, standing, leaning forward, one finger pointed like a weapon, and his wife Mary, sitting with one hand pressed to her stomach and her head bowed low, like a woman who had long ago stopped expecting anyone to come. Harry had built his life on the belief that he knew these two women. He was about to discover he had only ever known one of them. Harry Johnson had never once seen his mother sit idle. Not on Christmas morning, not on the Sunday afternoons when other families sprawled across couches watching television with their shoes off. Not even on the evening his father left, when a lesser woman might have crumbled at the kitchen table. Eunice Johnson had simply straightened her spine, retied her apron, and started scrubbing dishes with the focused energy of someone settling a debt. That image had lived inside Harry his entire life. His mother at the sink, back straight, jaw set, getting on with it. She had raised him alone in a narrow house on Clement Street, where the pipes knocked in winter and the neighbours played music too loud on Friday nights. There was never quite enough money, but there was always enough structure. Eunice ran their home the way a general runs a campaign, with schedules, expectations and consequences for falling short. Dinner at 6:30, homework before television. Shoes polished the night before school, never the morning of. Mornings are for moving forward, she used to say, not for fixing what you should have done yesterday. Harry had absorbed every word. By 16, he was ironing his own shirts. By 22, he had graduated top of his class and accepted a position at a firm downtown before his peers had finished celebrating. His colleagues marveled at his composure under pressure. His supervisors called him self-made. Harry always smiled politely and said nothing, because the truth was simpler and more complicated than they understood. He wasn't self-made, he was Eunice-made. He had spent his childhood watching her move through the world in her green suit, the one she bought second-hand and wore like it was tailored, and he had decided, somewhere in the wordless logic of boyhood, that this was what strength looked like. Not softness, not yielding. Strength was preparation. Strength was standards. Strength was never letting anyone see you buckle. So when Harry brought Mary home for the first time and Eunice had tilted her head with that particular expression, not quite disapproval, not quite welcome, he had told himself it was simply his mother's way. Her high standards applied to everyone. It wasn't personal. It was Eunice. Mary had laughed it off. She was warm that way, generous with grace, willing to give people the benefit of every doubt available to them. She had squeezed Harry's hand in the car afterward and said, "She just needs time." Harry had believed her, because it was easier than believing the alternative. He had spent years inside the cathedral of his mother's excellence, learning to mistake her hardness for virtue. It had made him disciplined, dependable, and quietly blind to the difference between a woman who demands the best from people and a woman who simply demands. He was still learning to tell them apart. Mary had chosen the pink dress herself. That detail mattered, though Harry never thought to ask about it. She had found it on a Saturday afternoon 3 months into the pregnancy, in a little boutique 2 blocks from the pharmacy, and she had stood in the narrow changing room with both hands cradling the small swell of her stomach, looking at her reflection, and felt, for the first time in weeks, something close to herself again. She bought it without hesitation, wore it home on the bus, walked through the front door glowing. Eunice had looked up from the kitchen table, taken one slow survey from collar to hem, and said, "You're not going out in that, I hope. It's a little loud for your condition." Mary had laughed, a short, careful laugh, the kind you use when you're not sure yet if something is a joke. It wasn't a joke. That was in February. By April, the pink dress had moved to the back of the wardrobe, not because Harry asked, not because Mary decided, but because wearing it meant a comment, and comments from Eunice arrived like water finding a crack, small, persistent, and eventually capable of splitting stone. It had started gently enough that Mary genuinely hadn't recognized it as a pattern. A raised eyebrow at the dinner table when Mary reached for a second helping. A quiet remark about how some women let pregnancy become an excuse for laziness. An observation, delivered with surgical pleasantness, that Mary's braids were looking a little untidy, and that Harry's clients sometimes visited the house and impressions mattered. Mary had retied her braids that same evening, standing at the bathroom mirror with her arms aching from the angle 8 weeks from her due date. Telling herself that Eunice meant well. She had told herself that so many times the phrase had lost its shape entirely. The joy didn't vanish all at once. That was the thing nobody warned you about. It didn't leave in a dramatic rush. It retreated, slowly, quietly, the way light leaves a room when the sun moves rather than when someone switches it off. Mary stopped humming while she cooked, stopped calling her sister on Sunday afternoons, stopped mentioning the baby's name aloud in Eunice's presence because once, just once, Eunice had wrinkled her nose and said it sounded informal. She started measuring herself through Eunice's eyes before anyone else's, checking her posture, moderating her laugh, choosing words the way you choose steps on uncertain ground, carefully, quietly, always braced for the surface to give way. Harry saw none of it, or perhaps he saw pieces he didn't know how to assemble. He saw his wife grow quieter and called it tiredness. He saw her eyes dim slightly and called it the pregnancy. He never once thought to call it what it was, a woman disappearing, one small comment at a time, inside a house that was supposed to be her home. The house was lit from within when Harry pulled into the driveway. He sat in the car for a moment longer than necessary, engine idling, watching the warm glow behind the curtains the way a man watches something he loves without knowing he's doing it. He had been thinking about Mary on the drive home, specifically about the way she used to press her palm flat against his chest when she laughed, like she needed something to hold onto. He couldn't remember the last time she had laughed like that. He told himself tonight would be different. He had left the office at 5. He had stopped for the mango sorbet she had been craving since January. He was going to sit beside her on the couch, shoes off, phone face down, and simply be present in the uncomplicated way he had been failing at for months. He locked the car and walked to the front door quietly, some instinct making him reach for his keys slowly, turn the handle without the usual jangle and push. He stepped inside. The hallway was dim, the sitting room ahead lit by the overhead light, and what reached him first was not a sight but a sound. His mother's voice, low, controlled, and precise in the way that a blade is precise. Not shouting. Eunice never shouted. Shouting was for people who hadn't mastered the more efficient art of making someone feel small without raising your pitch. Harry stopped. He stood in the shadow of the hallway, his jacket still on, the bag with the sorbet hanging from his right hand, and he watched. Eunice stood at the center of the room in her green suit, posture immaculate, one finger extended toward Mary the way you'd point at something that had disappointed you, not a person, a thing. Her face wore the expression Harry had seen 1,000 times across the dinner table of his childhood. The expression that said she was not angry. She was simply correct, and the other person was simply wrong, and wasn't it exhausting, being the only one who could see it? Mary sat in the armchair by the window. One hand rested on her stomach. The other gripped the armrest with the quiet tension of a woman holding herself together by the thinnest available thread. Her head was slightly bowed, her braids falling forward, and from where Harry stood he could see the particular stillness of her shoulders, not relaxed stillness, but the stillness of someone who has learned that movement invites more. She wasn't crying, That struck him somehow as worse than if she had been. She had the look of a woman who had already spent her tears on this a long time ago, and had since arrived somewhere beyond them. Harry stood in the dark of his own hallway and did not move. The sorbet was cold in his hand. His mother's voice continued, measured and relentless. He understood, with a clarity that arrived like cold water, that he was not witnessing an argument. He was witnessing a routine. Harry still hadn't moved. He knew he should step forward, announce himself. Let the sound of his footstep on the hardwood floor end whatever this was. But something held him, not cowardice exactly, but the paralysis of a man whose entire understanding of a situation is being rewritten faster than he can process it. He needed to hear it. He needed to be certain he wasn't misreading, misinterpreting, doing what Mary had always quietly accused him of, finding the most comfortable explanation and settling into it. So he listened. The doctor said your iron is low. Eunice's voice was conversational, almost pleasant, the way a surgeon's tone stays level while the hands do something terrible. That's what happens when you don't maintain a proper diet. I've told you this. I've told you repeatedly. But you seem to feel that because you're carrying his child, the normal rules of self-discipline simply don't apply to you. Mary said nothing. And the house? Eunice let the pause breathe, let it do its work. I came by yesterday while Harry was at the office. The kitchen, Mary. The kitchen. My son works 14-hour days so that you can live in a house like this and you can't manage to keep the counters clean. What exactly are you doing with your time? Still nothing from Mary, just that hand on her stomach moving in the smallest possible circle. Slow, private, meant only for the baby. You know what my concern is? Eunice lowered her finger, folded her hands together, which was somehow worse, more deliberate, more judicial. My concern is that Harry is too loyal to say what people around him can plainly see. You were not prepared for this family. You were not prepared for what this life requires, and bringing a child into that unpreparedness is. Please. Mary's voice came out barely above a whisper, but it fell into the room like something dropped from a height. Harry felt it in his chest. I'm asking you to please stop. Eunice blinked, a slow, patient blink, the kind that says the other person has confirmed exactly what you suspected about them. I'm not going to stop, Mary. Someone has to say these things. Harry won't because he protects you. I have no interest in protecting you from the truth. And then Mary looked up. Harry saw her face fully for the first time, and the sight of it did something to him that no argument, no rational understanding, no slow accumulation of evidence ever could have. Because it wasn't the tears that undid him, though her eyes were glossy and rimmed red. It was the absence of surprise on her face. The complete, exhausted, devastating lack of shock at anything Eunice had just said. This was not new to her. Not a single word of it. She had been sitting in this chair, in this conversation, in one form or another, for months. Harry was only now finding the room that Mary had been locked inside all along. Harry stepped out of the shadow. He didn't announce himself. Didn't clear his throat or call anyone's name. He simply moved forward into the light of the sitting room, and the sound of his shoe on the hardwood was enough. Eunice turned first. She had always been sharp that way, alert to shifts in a room, and the expression that crossed her face lasted only a fraction of a second before she rearranged it. But Harry had spent 34 years studying that face, and he caught it. Surprise, then something that might have been the earliest, most fleeting signal of shame. Then, almost instantly, composure. Harry, she said his name the way she always did, warmly, with the particular ownership of a woman who considered him her finest work. You're home early. I was just. I heard you. The 3 words landed quietly. He hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. Eunice's own training had taught him that, the understanding that volume was for people who hadn't yet learned that stillness carries further. His mother paused, recalibrated. Then you heard me expressing some concerns that, frankly, someone in this family needed to. How long? She stopped. Harry set the bag down on the side table without looking at it. He was looking at his mother with the focused, unblinking attention of a man who has just understood that he has been careless with something precious and is only now calculating the full cost of it. His voice stayed level, controlled, Eunice's own gift turned in her direction. How long has this been happening? The question wasn't for his mother. He turned to Mary as he asked it, and the gentleness that entered his face when he did, the sudden, aching softness of a man recognizing his own failure, seemed to unsteady Eunice more than any anger would have. Mary looked at him for a long moment. Her hand was still on her stomach. Her eyes moved across his face like she was checking for something, testing whether what she saw there was real or another version of the careful blindness she had learned not to rely on. "A long time," she said quietly. Harry held her gaze, nodded once slowly, not the nod of a man receiving information, but of a man accepting a verdict. He turned back to his mother. Eunice had drawn herself up to her full height. The green suit, the immaculate posture, the expression of patient authority she had worn his entire life, the one that said she was reasonable and everyone else was being emotional. She opened her mouth to speak, to explain, to reframe, to do what she had always done so expertly. "Don't," Harry said. Just that, one word, but something in his tone made her close her mouth again. For the first time in Harry Johnson's memory, his mother did not know what to say. And the silence that followed was the loudest thing he had ever heard in that house. The silence didn't last long. Eunice was too practiced for silence. She had spent decades understanding that the person who speaks first after a pause often loses ground, but she had also spent decades understanding that ground once ceded is difficult to recover. She made her calculation quickly, the way she always did, and when she spoke again her voice had shifted, softer now, more measured, carrying the particular texture of a woman who has decided that reason, not authority, is the better weapon for this moment. "Harry," she moved toward him slightly, not enough to crowd, just enough to close the space between them into something more private, more familial, a conversation between the two of them rather than a confrontation of three. "I know what you think you heard, but you need to understand something about the last few months." He didn't respond. She took it as permission to continue. "Pregnancy changes a woman." She said it gently, clinically, the way she might explain weather, the hormones, the anxiety, it affects perception. What feels like criticism to Mary right now in her condition is not necessarily what was intended. She takes things harder than they're meant. I've noticed it for weeks. Honestly, Harry, I've been worried about her emotional state. Harry's eyes moved briefly to Mary, then back. "She cried last week," Eunice continued, "because I suggested she rest more. She took it as an insult. I've been walking on eggshells in this house trying to support her while you're at the office, and I'm telling you, gently, because I love you, that the instability you're seeing right now is not something I caused. It's something I've been managing." It was beautifully done. Harry recognized that distantly, the way you can recognize the technical skill in something that is nonetheless causing you harm. She had taken the evidence against her and reframed it as evidence of her sacrifice. She had made herself the quiet, suffering caretaker and made Mary the problem to be managed, and she had done it in under a minute. "She's been under a great deal of stress," Eunice added, her voice dropping further into something that resembled genuine concern. "I've been saying for months that she needs more support, more restructure. That's all I've ever been trying to provide." The room was very still. Then Mary laughed. It was a short sound, not bitter, not hysterical, but exhausted in a way that went beyond tiredness into something closer to the bone. She pressed her free hand briefly over her eyes. "Structure," she repeated softly, almost to herself. And something about that single word, the quiet devastation inside it, cut through every careful sentence Eunice had just constructed more cleanly than any argument could have. Harry looked at his mother, at the composed face, the steady eyes, the performance of concern, so polished, so practiced. He thought about Mary's braids, the pink dress at the back of the wardrobe, the laugh that arrived slowly now. He thought about how long it takes to drain someone. And he understood, finally and completely, that his mother hadn't been managing Mary at all. She had been dismantling her. It happened quietly, the way the most frightening things often do. Mary had not raised her voice, had not escalated, not matched Eunice's energy, not done any of the things that might have signaled to someone watching that the situation was approaching a dangerous threshold. She had simply sat in the chair, one hand on her stomach, absorbing everything the room contained. The confrontation, the manipulation, the specific exhaustion of finally being witnessed after months of being invisible. And her body, which had been carrying all of it long before tonight, made a decision her composure hadn't. She made a sound. Small, involuntary, the kind of sound that stops a room. Her hand pressed harder against her stomach, and she leaned forward slightly, the colour leaving her face with a speed that turned Harry cold. Mary, he was across the room before the word finished leaving his mouth. He reached her and crouched down, both hands finding hers. His eyes moving across her face with a focus that had nothing of the boardroom in it. This was rawer than that, older than that, the pure animal attention of someone watching another person they cannot afford to lose. She exhaled carefully, something doesn't feel right. Those 5 words rearranged everything. Harry stood, his hand remaining in hers as he straightened, his other hand already reaching for his phone. His voice when he spoke was calm in the specific way that calm is a choice rather than a feeling, deliberate, focused, because someone in the room needed to be those things, and it was going to be him. "We're going to the hospital, right now, can you stand?" She nodded, though the movement was slow. He helped her up with both hands, his arm moving around her back, adjusting to her weight with the instinct of someone who should have been doing this every day for months and knew it. Eunice had not moved from her position at the center of the room. She stood watching with an expression that Harry could not look at for long, not because it was cruel, but because it was so thoroughly, horrifyingly neutral. Like a woman watching weather rather than her daughter-in-law and unborn grandchild. "Harry, I'm sure it's just..." "Don't," the word again, the same word. But this time it contained something it hadn't before, not just command, but warning. The quiet, final warning of a man who has reached the outermost boundary of something and will not be moved backward from it. He didn't look at her again. He kept his arm around Mary and walked her toward the door, his phone to his ear, his voice steady as he spoke to the emergency line. Mary leaned into him, not helplessly, but with the particular weight of someone allowing themselves, after a very long time, to be held. Outside, the night air was cool against them both. Harry opened the car door, helped her in, rounded to the driver's side, and as he started the engine he reached across and took her hand without saying anything. Sometimes there is nothing to say. Sometimes you simply drive. Eunice arrived at the hospital 40 minutes after they did. Harry heard her before he saw her, the precise click of her heels on the linoleum, the particular cadence that had soundtracked his entire childhood, purposeful and unhurried, the walk of a woman who had never once entered a room unsure of her right to be there. He was standing in the corridor outside the maternity ward when she appeared at the end of the hallway, green suit still immaculate, handbag at her elbow, composure intact in the way that had always impressed him and now made something tighten in his chest. She moved toward him with her arms slightly open, already arranging her face into the expression of a concerned mother, and Harry took one step that was neither toward her nor away, just a single, deliberate repositioning that placed him more squarely in the center of the corridor. She stopped. Something in his posture told her to. "How is she?" Eunice asked. The question was genuine enough in its surface. She was good at genuine surfaces. "The doctors are monitoring her. The baby is stable." He delivered it like a report, precise, minimal, not a syllable of warmth added or subtracted. "Mary is exhausted and her blood pressure is elevated and they want to keep her overnight." Eunice nodded slowly, opened her mouth. "I need to say something to you," Harry said, "and I need you to hear it completely before you respond." She closed her mouth, folded her hands. In another context it might have looked like patience. Harry knew it was strategy, give him the floor then dismantle what he builds. He had watched her do it his entire life. "Not tonight. I have spent 34 years," he began, and his voice was quiet, entirely steady. The composure she had built in him now assembled and aimed in a direction she had never anticipated, believing that your harshness was love, that your criticism was investment, that the way you made people feel small was somehow for their benefit, because that's what you always said, and I didn't know how to question it. Eunice's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "I know now," he held her gaze without effort. "What you have been doing to Mary in my house for months, that is not love, that is not concern, that is not family, and it ends tonight. Harry, you are upset and I understand." "I am clear," he said, "there's a difference." He let that settle before he continued. "You are my mother, that will not change, but you are not welcome in my home, not next week. Not until Mary decides otherwise, not me, her. If and when she extends that invitation, I will support it. Until then, your authority ends at my doorstep." The word, her word, returned to her. Eunice stood very still in the fluorescent light of the corridor, and for the second time that evening, she had nothing to say. Harry nodded once, not unkindly, but with the irreversible finality of a door being closed. and turned back toward the ward. Toward Mary, toward his daughter, toward the life he was at last choosing. They kept Mary overnight, and then one night became two. Harry slept in the chair beside her bed both nights, his jacket folded beneath his head, his phone silenced and face down on the windowsill. Nurses offered him the family waiting room. He thanked them and stayed. Mary didn't ask him to. She didn't need to. Something had shifted between them in the car on the way to the hospital, in the silence and the held hand and the steady way he had driven, and whatever it was didn't require words to maintain. On the second morning, a doctor with kind eyes and a measured voice told them that the baby was perfectly healthy, that Mary's blood pressure had stabilized, and that what she needed most now was rest. Genuine rest. The kind that lives in the body, not just in the hours spent horizontal. Harry nodded and looked at his wife and thought about everything that word had meant in their home, and everything it was going to have to mean differently from now on. They discharged her on a Thursday afternoon. The drive home was quiet in the way that comfortable things are quiet, not empty, but full of something that didn't need to be spoken. Mary watched the city move past her window, one hand resting on her stomach, and Harry drove with both hands on the wheel and the particular attentiveness of a man who has recently learned the cost of not paying attention. He pulled into the driveway and cut the engine, and neither of them moved immediately. "She won't be coming back," Harry said, not a question. "I know," Mary said. "Not without you deciding it first." Mary turned to look at him then, really look at him, the way she hadn't in months, openly, without the protective film of careful management between them. Whatever she found in his face appeared to satisfy something that had been waiting a long time to be satisfied. "Okay," she said quietly. Inside. The house was exactly as they had left it 3 days ago, and yet it felt altered in some way that had nothing to do with furniture or light. Harry carried her bag in and set it by the stairs, and stood for a moment in the hallway, the same hallway where he had stood in shadow and watched, and finally understood, and then walked into the sitting room and opened the curtains wider than they usually went. Afternoon light fell across the floor in long, warm panels. Mary came and stood beside him, and he put his arm around her, careful and deliberate, and she leaned into him the way she had outside the house that night, with full weight, with trust, with the quiet relief of a woman who has set something very heavy down. "I want to put the pink dress back in the front of the wardrobe," she said after a while. Harry looked at her. "Then that's where it belongs," he said. It was a small thing. It was everything. The house, for the first time in longer than either of them could name, felt like it belonged to them, just them, and within its walls, in the light of an ordinary Thursday afternoon, something that had nearly been lost began, slowly and with great tenderness, to grow back.